At dawn on June 10, 1944, a Sherman tank called Angel of Death climbed over a hedgerow in Normandy and stopped. For 3 seconds it hung there, belly exposed, tracks spinning in open air. That was long enough. A German gun in the next field found the soft underside no one had armored, because no one had ever needed to. The tank burned with 4 men still inside. It was not the first Sherman to die that way that week. It would not be the last. Within a month, tank crews in Normandy would suffer casualty rates approaching 80%, killed not by superior enemy tanks, but by hedges. Ordinary farm hedges, 4 feet thick, that had stood in these fields for 300 years. The United States Army had planned for beeches. It had planned for German steel. It had not planned for shrubbery. The fix, when it came, would not come from a general, an engineer, or a laboratory. It would come from a sergeant with a welding torch, scrap iron from a German beach obstacle, and an idea that every man in his unit had laughed at 1 week earlier. The hedge did not look like much. 4 feet of tangled hawthorn and blackthorn, roots sunk into an earthen bank that Norman farmers had been building since before the Battle of Hastings. To a man walking past it in peacetime, it was nothing. A property line, a windbreak, something cows leaned against. To a Sherman tank in June of 1944, it was a wall that could not be seen through, could not be driven around, and could only be crossed by climbing. That was the problem nobody in Washington had thought to plan for. The invasion planners had studied the beaches of Normandy for over a year. They had photographed the tides, mapped the sand, measured the slope of every approach at Omaha and Utah and the British and Canadian sectors beyond. They had rehearsed the landing until it was a machine with 10,000 moving parts. And on June 6th, that machine worked. Men died on the beaches, more than anyone wanted to admit. But the beaches were taken. The invasion held. Then the army walked inland, and inland was bocage country. The Normandy countryside was cut into thousands of small fields, most no larger than a city block, each one bordered by an earthen bank topped with a dense hedgerow of trees and thornbush, grown thick over centuries. Farmers had built the banks originally to fence livestock and mark boundaries between families who had lived on the same land for generations. Nobody had built them to stop a war, but that was what they did. A tank crew moving through bocage could not see the next field until they were in it. Sunken lanes ran between the hedges like trenches, barely wide enough for a vehicle, walled in on both sides by earth and root. German infantry armed with Panzerfausts and machine guns waited in the corners of these tiny fields, sometimes 50 yards from the American line, invisible until they fired. It was, said the men who fought through it, like being asked to conduct a war inside a maze built by an enemy who already knew every turn. For the Sherman tank, the geometry was worse than inconvenient. It was lethal. The Sherman's armor was designed to protect the front and sides, where enemy fire was expected to come from in open, rolling terrain. Its belly, the underside of the hull, carried almost no protection at all, because no engineer had imagined a battlefield where a tank would need to expose its stomach to the enemy on purpose. But that was exactly what bocage forced it to do. To cross a hedgerow, a Sherman had no option but to climb the earthen bank nose first, tracks clawing for purchase, the entire front end lifting skyward, while the thin, unarmored belly tilted toward whatever was waiting on the other side. For 3, 4, sometimes 5 seconds, the tank hung there, exposed, blind, unable to bring its main gun to bear because the barrel pointed uselessly at the sky. German gunners across Normandy learned the pattern within days of the invasion. They did not need heavy artillery. A well-placed anti-tank gun, even a single Panzerfaust fired from concealment, could put a round through the exposed underside and end a tank and its crew in the same instant the tracks came down on the far side of the hedge. By early July 1944, barely a month after the landings, American armored casualties in Normandy had reached numbers that shocked commanders who had planned for a war of movement. Historian Stephen Zaloga would later calculate that tank crew casualty rates in the hedgerow fighting approached 80%. Not 80% of tanks destroyed, 80% of the men who rode inside them killed, wounded, or burned. In a campaign that had been expected to break out of Normandy within days, and instead ground to a standstill measured in yards. Yards. Not miles. Some divisions advanced less than a mile in 3 weeks of fighting through hedges that all looked the same, in fields that had no names on any map anyone carried. The men living through it did not need statistics to understand what was happening. They only needed to watch a tank called Angel of Death, or Bloody Bucket, or any of 100 nicknames painted on Sherman hulls by crews trying to make friends with machines that might kill them, climb a hedge and stop at the top, hanging there while a German gun somewhere in the next field found its mark. The bocage had its own smell that summer, diesel exhaust and cordite, and the wet green rot of hedges torn open by shell fire, mixed with something else the veterans rarely spoke about afterward, the particular smell of a tank that had burned with men still inside it. Infantry learned to recognize the sound a Sherman made when it took a hit in the belly, a flat, heavy crack followed by silence, then sometimes screaming, then more silence. They learned to stop flinching at it, because flinching did not change anything, and there was always another field, another hedge, another few hundred yards to cross before dark. Among the men trying to solve this problem was a 29-year-old sergeant named Curtis Culin III, though everyone who knew him called him Bud. Culin had grown up in Cranford, New Jersey, an only child in a family with deep roots and a name that stretched back 3 generations to a Revolutionary War officer named Colonel Curtis Grubb. The Culins were comfortable, respected, the kind of family whose name appeared in the local paper for reasons other than trouble. Bud graduated from Cranford High School in 1935, in the middle of the Depression, into a country that had more young men than jobs. He was not a soldier by nature or by early ambition. He was, by most accounts, a practical young man from a practical town, the kind of place where a man learned to fix what was broken, because calling someone to fix it cost money nobody had extra of. The Depression had taught an entire generation of young Americans that lesson before the Army ever got the chance to. You did not throw away a thing because it was bent or rusted or missing a part. You looked at it, turned it over in your hands, and figured out what it could still become. When he enlisted, he joined the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit with roots in the New Jersey National Guard, so old it still carried the nickname the Essex Troop, a name that reached back to horse cavalry and a New Jersey militia tradition older than the tanks his unit now rode into France. By June 1944, the 102nd had been folded into the 2nd Armored Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the United States Army. Veterans of North Africa and Sicily, now thrown into the bocage, alongside every other American division discovering the same terrible truth about hedges and armor and blind, upward angles. Culin was a sergeant, not an officer, not an engineer, not anyone whose job description included solving tactical problems for the United States Army. His job was reconnaissance, scouting, finding the enemy before the enemy found you, then reporting back. It was dangerous work in open country. In the bocage, with visibility measured in yards and death waiting behind every hedge, it was closer to blind man's stick, feeling for the edge of a cliff nobody could see. Every unit in Normandy that summer was full of men trying to solve the hedgerow problem in whatever spare hour the fighting allowed them. Engineers experimented with explosive charges to blow gaps in the banks, but the charges were slow to place under fire and consumed explosives that were needed elsewhere. Some crews welded pipes and salvaged rails to the fronts of their tanks, crude battering rams that mostly just got stuck in the dirt. Nothing worked well enough to matter, and every failed attempt cost time the Army did not have, because somewhere behind German lines, Field Marshal Rommel's forces were digging in deeper every day the breakout was delayed. It was during one of these idle, frustrated conversations, the kind soldiers have while waiting for orders or waiting for death, whichever comes first, that a private in Culin's unit, a soldier from Tennessee, remembered afterward only as Roberts, said something that should have been forgotten within the hour. The men were talking, as they often did, about the hedges, about the tanks that kept dying at the top of the banks, about the fact that 11 months of training at Fort Knox and Fort Benning had never once mentioned hedges, because nobody who wrote the training manuals had ever needed to drive a tank through the French countryside at gunpoint. Roberts, a farm boy who understood hedgerows the way city men understood traffic lights, said it almost as a joke. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges instead of climbing over them?" The men around him laughed. It was the kind of idea that sounded, on its face, like something a child would draw in the margins of a notebook. Saw teeth on a 30-ton tank, as if the war could be won with a tool from a carpenter's shed. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody reported it up the chain. It was a joke told by tired men to pass the time between one terrifying hedge and the next. And by the standards of every army that had ever fought a war, it should have died there, forgotten by nightfall, one more idle thought, lost in the mud of Normandy. Almost everyone who heard it laughed and moved on. Almost everyone except the sergeant standing nearby, who did not laugh and who did not forget. Curtis Culin had spent his whole life around men who fixed things with whatever was lying around, because nothing else was available. Roberts's joke did not sound like a joke to him. It sounded like the only idea anyone in Normandy had proposed all month that might actually work, and he could not stop turning it over in his mind, even as the artillery rumbled somewhere to the south and the next hedge waited, patient and green and full of Germans, exactly like the last one, and the one before that, and all the ones still to come. That night, lying in whatever ditch or barn or half-collapsed farmhouse his squadron had claimed for a few hours of sleep, Culin kept picturing it. Not saw teeth exactly, nothing so delicate. Something heavier, something that could survive being driven into a wall of root and earth at 10 miles an hour without shattering. He thought about the German beach obstacles they had passed on the way inland, the steel rail sections planted at angles in the sand to gut landing craft, most of them broken now, scattered along the dunes like the ribs of some dead iron animal. Nobody was using that steel for anything. It was just lying there, rusting, waiting for someone to look at it the way his whole life had trained him to look at broken things, and ask what it could still become. He did not tell anyone what he was thinking. Not yet. He had watched enough good ideas die in the mouths of men who spoke too soon to officers who had no patience left for anything that was not already in a manual. If this was going to happen, it was going to happen quietly, on his own time, with his own hands, before anyone had the chance to laugh at it twice. The next morning, Culin did not say a word about hedges or saw teeth or Roberts's joke. He went about his duties as a sergeant in a reconnaissance squadron, the way he had every day since Normandy began, scouting narrow lanes, reporting German positions, watching men he knew get wounded or killed by an enemy they rarely saw before the enemy saw them. But somewhere underneath the routine, the idea kept working on him, the way a splinter works its way toward the surface of skin. He found his chance during a lull in the fighting, one of those brief gaps that opened when a unit was pulled back a few hundred yards to regroup, resupply, and wait for orders that always seemed to take longer than the men waiting for them wanted. It was during one of these lulls that Culin walked down toward the beach area where supplies were still being unloaded and wreckage from the invasion still littered the sand weeks after D-Day. Even weeks after the landings, the beach still carried the evidence of what it had cost to take it. Landing craft sat half-sunk in the shallows where they had been abandoned. Waterlogged crates of supplies nobody had gotten around to moving lay stacked above the tide line. The sand itself had a churned, poisoned look to it, as though the ground remembered what had happened there even after the bodies had been recovered and the wounded evacuated and the fighting had moved 3 miles inland to the hedges. The Germans had planted obstacles along that beach for years before the invasion, expecting an assault that would come by sea and never imagining it would be defeated by nothing more than time, tide, and overwhelming force. Steel rail sections, driven into the sand at angles, sometimes called Czech hedgehogs for the shape their crossed beams made, sometimes just called beach obstacles by the men who had to clear them. Many had been blown apart by naval gunfire before the landing craft ever reached shore. Others had been dragged clear by engineers and left in heaps, twisted, rusting, forgotten by everyone except the salvage crews who had not yet gotten around to hauling them away. There was a particular irony in that steel. One Culin may or may not have consciously registered as he walked among it. German engineers had positioned these obstacles with great precision, calculating exact angles and depths meant to gut an American landing craft at the exact moment the tide brought it within reach. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's propaganda machine had called it, an unbreakable line of steel and concrete that would drown the invasion before it ever reached dry land. It had not worked. The wall had been breached in a single morning, at a cost the men who paid it would carry for the rest of their lives, and now its broken pieces lay scattered and useless, waiting for someone to decide they were something other than scrap. Culin walked among the wreckage with the eye of a man who had spent a childhood in a New Jersey town, watching adults make do with less than they needed. He was not looking for anything specific. He was looking the way he had always looked at broken things, waiting for one of them to answer a question he had not fully asked yet. He found his answer in a pile of bent rail sections, thick angled steel that had been engineered by the German army to rip open the hull of a landing craft. It occurred to him that steel strong enough to tear through the bottom of a boat might be strong enough to tear through the roots and packed earth of a Normandy hedgerow. He did not requisition the steel through any official channel. There was no form for what he wanted to do. No supply officer whose job it was to authorize scrap metal for an idea that existed only in one sergeant's head. He simply took what he needed, loaded it onto a jeep, and brought it back to where his unit's tanks were parked, alongside a handful of men who trusted him enough not to ask too many questions before they had something to see. Building the first hedgerow cutter took welding equipment, patience, and the willingness to fail in front of an audience of skeptical men who had already laughed once at the idea behind it. Culin worked with a small crew, cutting the salvaged rail into lengths, shaping the ends into points, and welding 4 of these steel prongs across a frame that could be bolted or welded directly onto the front of a Sherman's hull, low and angled forward, like the tusks of some animal nobody had ever seen because no such animal existed outside of a scrapyard in Normandy. The design was crude by any engineering standard. It was not tested in a laboratory. It was not reviewed by ordnance officers or vetted through the layers of approval that any new piece of military equipment was supposed to pass through before it reached a combat unit. It was built by hand, in the field, by men with no formal training in tank design, using steel that had been intended by a German engineer to kill American soldiers on a beach, and was now being reshaped to save American soldiers in a field 3 miles inland. The welding itself took hours, stretched across whatever windows of relative quiet the front allowed. A generator had to be found and kept running. The rail steel, thick and unevenly shaped from its time as a beach obstacle, resisted being cut and reshaped, and more than once the work had to stop while someone found a sharper blade or a different angle to attack the metal. The men helping Culin were not volunteers in any official sense. They were soldiers from his own unit who trusted him enough, or were curious enough, or simply had nothing better to do during a lull in the fighting, to spend an afternoon holding steel steady while sparks rained down around their boots. Nobody involved believed they were making history. They believed, at best, that they were trying something that would probably fail, the way most improvised fixes on a battlefield failed, and that trying costs nothing but time nobody particularly needed for anything else. When it was finished, it looked almost comically simple. 4 steel teeth jutting out from the front of a 30-ton tank, welded on at an angle, low enough to bite into the base of a hedgerow rather than the branches above it. Some of the men who saw it standing there for the first time laughed again, the same laugh that had greeted Roberts's joke a few days earlier. It looked like something a boy would build in a junkyard, not a piece of equipment meant to solve a problem that had stalled an entire army. Culin did not care what it looked like. He wanted to know what it would do. The first test came without ceremony, without observers from headquarters, without anyone from outside the unit watching. A single Sherman, prongs welded to its nose, rolled toward the base of a hedgerow at a modest speed, the same speed any tank would use approaching an obstacle it expected to climb rather than cut through. The tank did not climb. The steel teeth bit into the earthen bank at its base, found the tangle of roots that had anchored that hedge in place for longer than the United States had existed as a country, and instead of lifting the tank skyward, the way every hedge before it had done, the prongs held the nose down and low while the engine drove forward. Dirt and root and thorn bush erupted outward in a spray as the tank tore straight through the base of the hedge, rather than over the top of it, emerging on the other side with its belly never leaving the ground, its main gun never once pointing uselessly at the sky. It worked. For a moment nobody said anything. The engine noise died down, dust and torn vegetation still settling around the tank, and the small crowd of soldiers who had gathered to watch, most of them expecting to see the same failure they had watched a dozen times before with pipes and rails and other improvised battering devices, simply stood there. Then someone laughed, but it was a different laugh than the one that had greeted Roberts's joke a few days earlier. It was the laugh of men who could not quite believe what they had just seen. Relief and disbelief tangled together in the same breath. Not perfectly, not on the first attempt without adjustment. The angle of the prongs needed correcting after the first pass, and later versions would be reinforced to survive repeated use without bending. But it worked well enough, immediately and unmistakably, that the men who had laughed a few days earlier stopped laughing and started asking how many more of these Culin could build, and how soon. What Culin did not know, and would not learn until later, was that his unit was not the only one asking the same question that summer. Across the American sector in Normandy, other soldiers facing the identical nightmare of exposed bellies and stalled advances were arriving at strikingly similar answers, entirely independent of one another, born from the same desperate arithmetic of dead crews and stalled timetables. In the 79th Infantry Division, engineers and tank crews had been experimenting with their own hedge-cutting device, and by the 5th of July, more than a week before Culin's prongs had even reached General Bradley's attention, the 79th had a working cutter mounted and operating in the field. Their approach differed slightly in design, but attacked the same problem from the same basic insight, that a hedge could be torn through at its base rather than climbed over at its crown. Within the 19th Corps, a set of steel prongs originally designed for an entirely different purpose, punching holes in hedgerow banks so engineers could pack explosive charges into them, was found almost by accident to work nearly as well simply lifting and tearing the hedge apart under a tank's own forward momentum. No explosives required at all once someone noticed what the prongs were already doing on their own. In V Corps, other crews built their own versions and gave them their own names: brush cutters, green dozers, each one a slightly different answer to a question that had become urgent enough that dozens of men across dozens of units had independently begun asking it at the same time, in the same weeks, without any of them knowing the others existed. This was not the story of one lone genius solving a problem that had stumped an army of fools. It was the story of an entire generation of soldiers, trained for a different kind of war, encountering an obstacle nobody had prepared them for, and responding the way men raised during the Depression had been taught to respond to almost everything. Not by waiting for someone else to fix it, by picking up whatever was lying around and making it work. That so many of them arrived at nearly identical solutions within the same few weeks, independently, without coordination, said less about any one man's genius and more about how obvious the answer became once enough desperate, practical men were given the freedom to stop following a manual that had nothing useful left to tell them. What separated Culin's version from the others was not its cleverness. It was timing, and it was luck, the same two forces that decide far more of history than most retellings care to admit. His prongs happened to be ready, tested, and proven in the field during the exact window when the highest levels of American command were searching with mounting desperation for any solution to present before the launch of the offensive everyone knew was coming. But it was Culin's version, tested and proven in the field by the second week of July, that reached the right ears at the right moment, in a war where timing mattered more than justice. Word of the hedgerow cutter moved up through the chain of command, the way good news rarely does and bad news always does, slowly, filtered through officers reluctant to bring an unproven, unauthorized field modification to the attention of superiors who might question why such a thing existed without approval in the first place. But by mid-July 1944, the American breakout from Normandy was overdue by any measure anyone in command wanted to admit out loud. The invasion had been expected to reach a line deep into France within weeks. Instead, 6 weeks after D-Day, American forces were still fighting yard by yard through the same bocage that had swallowed Culin's unit and dozens like it. Every general from Eisenhower down understood that a war of attrition in the hedgerows favored the defender, and the defender was dug in, experienced, and running out of nothing but time, which was the one thing the Allies could not afford to keep spending at the current rate. The pre-invasion planners had drawn phase lines on their maps, projected dates by which Allied forces were expected to control certain roads, certain towns, certain stretches of French countryside on the way toward Paris and the German border beyond it. By mid-July, 6 weeks after the landings, American and British forces remained well behind almost every one of those projected lines. Newspapers back home printed maps showing the front barely creeping forward week to week, and in private, commanders from Eisenhower on down understood what the public did not yet fully grasp, that a campaign built around speed and maneuver was instead becoming a grinding contest of attrition, fought hedge by hedge, yard by yard, exactly the kind of fight that favored a well-dug-in defender over an attacker trying to keep to a schedule. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in the West before his own war ended weeks later when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft, understood the bocage as well as any man alive, and his forces exploited it with the same practical ruthlessness the Americans were now trying to answer with scrap steel and welding torches. Every hedge was a potential firing position. Every sunken lane was a potential kill zone. The Germans did not need to hold every field, only to make every field expensive enough that an army with limited time and limited patience would eventually be forced to either accept the cost or find another way through. It was in this atmosphere, tense with the knowledge that a massive offensive named Operation Cobra was being planned to finally break the stalemate, that word of the prong-equipped tanks reached Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st United States Army, and the officer who would decide, within days, whether Cobra would launch on schedule or be delayed yet again while armored units searched for a way through terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to favor the enemy. Bradley was not a general given to dramatic gestures or public displays of enthusiasm. He had built a reputation as a careful, methodical commander, the kind of officer who trusted engineering reports and casualty figures over battlefield rumor. It said something about how badly the Army needed an answer that a report about a sergeant's homemade steel prongs, built without authorization from scrap metal on a beach, made its way to his desk at all, let alone quickly enough to matter before Cobra's launch date. On July 14, 1944, a demonstration was arranged. It was not a ceremony. There was no band, no press, no formal review. A single tank fitted with Culin's prongs was brought before Bradley, and a handful of senior officers, positioned in front of an ordinary Normandy hedgerow, the same kind of obstacle that had already killed hundreds of American tank crewmen in the 6 weeks since the invasion began. The officers gathered at a cautious distance, the way men gather around any piece of unproven equipment that might fail in unpredictable ways. Whatever conversations passed among them in the minutes before the engine started have not survived in any detailed record. But it is not hard to imagine the skepticism in the air, the same skepticism that had greeted every version of this idea since Roberts first said it out loud as a joke. A row of senior officers, trained at West Point and career service academies, standing in a French field to watch a homemade contraption built from beach wreckage by a sergeant nobody in that group had heard of a month earlier. The tank started forward. According to accounts later recorded by military historians, including Max Hastings, Bradley watched as the hedgerow exploded outward under the force of the prongs, the tank punching straight through the bank, and the tangle of roots and thorn bush that had stopped so many others, emerging on the far side intact, belly never exposed, gun never pointed at the sky. The whole event lasted only seconds, the tank crossing from one field to the next in less time than it took to describe. But those seconds were the difference between a battlefield problem that had cost the Allies 6 weeks and thousands of casualties, and a battlefield problem that no longer existed. Bradley, a general known for a measured, unemotional temperament, was reportedly struck by what he saw. Here, in front of him, was a solution to the single greatest tactical problem currently facing his army. Built not by an engineer with a laboratory and a budget, but by a sergeant with a welding torch and scrap steel from a German beach obstacle that had washed up on the very shore his own men had stormed 6 weeks earlier. There was no need for further study, no committee to convene, no requisition process to slow things down. The evidence had just torn itself through a hedgerow in full view of the men who most needed to see it. Bradley did not wait for further testing, further reports, or further approval from anyone above him. He gave the order on the spot. Every available Sherman tank in the First Army was to be fitted with the device before Operation Cobra launched, a deadline that left barely 10 days to accomplish what would ordinarily have taken months of procurement and manufacturing under any normal Army supply process. Ordnance depots across the Normandy beachhead were instructed to begin mass production immediately, using whatever scrap steel could be gathered from the enormous quantities of wrecked German beach obstacles still scattered along miles of coastline, the same wreckage Culin had scavenged alone, on foot, with no authorization, only days before. What had been the work of one sergeant and a handful of curious volunteers now became the work of entire ordnance companies, welding crews operating in shifts around the clock, cutting and shaping steel salvaged from the same beaches where thousands of American soldiers had died 6 weeks earlier to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The urgency was staggering to anyone who understood how slowly military bureaucracy usually moved. Trucks were dispatched to gather beach wreckage. Improvised welding stations sprang up wherever generators and steel and manpower could be brought together. Tank crews who had spent 6 weeks watching their friends die at the top of hedgerows now found themselves waiting in line for their own vehicles to be fitted with a device that, only 2 weeks earlier, had existed nowhere but in the mind of a reconnaissance sergeant looking at a pile of junk on a beach. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, an estimated 60% of Sherman tanks in the First Army had been fitted with some version of the hedgerow cutter, most of them Culin's design or close variations of it. What had been a joke told by a Tennessee farm boy to pass the time, then a piece of scrap metal welded together by a sergeant working outside every official channel the Army possessed, was now standing equipment for an entire field army, preparing to launch the offensive that would, within 2 weeks, finally break the Germans out of Normandy and open the road toward Paris. The men who had laughed, in Culin's unit and in every other unit that had ridiculed a similar idea in the previous weeks, were no longer laughing. They were welding, checking angles, testing prongs against practice hedges, and waiting for an offensive that, for the first time in 6 weeks, they would enter without having to expose their bellies to the enemy, simply to cross from one field to the next. At 6 a.m. on July 25, 1944, American bombers began an assault on German positions west of St. Lo that would become one of the heaviest tactical bombardments of the entire war. Operation Cobra had begun. Thousands of tons of explosives fell on a narrow strip of the German line, and when the bombing lifted, American armor moved forward into terrain that had for 6 weeks been an unbroken nightmare of hedges and blind angles and burning tanks. This time was different. Sherman after Sherman approached the hedgerows that had claimed so many crews in June, and instead of climbing, nose lifted skyward, belly exposed to whatever waited on the other side, they lowered their steel prongs and drove straight through. Hedge after hedge gave way in explosions of dirt and root and torn thornbush, the tanks emerging on the far side with their bellies never leaving the ground and their guns never pointed uselessly at the sky. German positions that had been built around the assumption that American armor would be forced to expose itself at every hedgerow found, instead that the tanks simply were not stopping the way they were supposed to. Cobra broke the German line within days. American forces that had advanced barely a mile in 3 weeks during June now pushed forward miles in a matter of days, unraveling a defensive position that had taken the German army 6 weeks to build and reinforce. For the tank crews who had spent June watching their friends burn at the top of hedgerows, the change was almost disorienting. Fields that would have taken an hour to cross in June, with a tank stopping at every hedge to expose its belly and prey, now passed in minutes. The same terrain that had swallowed an army whole for 6 weeks suddenly stopped being an obstacle at all, and men who had learned to dread the sight of a hedgerow ahead of them found themselves driving through one after another without slowing down. Historians would later argue about how much credit belonged to the bombing, how much to the accumulated exhaustion of German defenders after weeks of continuous fighting, and how much to the simple fact that American tanks could finally move through bocage country without stopping to die at every hedge. But no serious account of the breakout from Normandy omits the hedgerow cutters entirely. They were not the only reason Cobra succeeded. They were one of the reasons American armor could finally move at the speed the entire operation depended on. And speed, after 6 weeks of a campaign that had nearly stalled out entirely, was the one thing every general in Normandy had been desperate for. Within the ranks of ordinary soldiers, credit for the invention spread quickly, and just as quickly, it simplified. It became, in the retelling that reached newspapers and eventually history books, the story of one man, Sergeant Curtis Culin, who single-handedly solved the hedgerow problem and saved the Normandy breakout. It was the kind of story an army fighting a long, grinding war badly wanted to tell, a clean narrative of individual ingenuity, triumphing over an impossible obstacle, delivered at exactly the moment morale needed a boost. It was not entirely true, and according to the sources that later examined the story most closely, Culin knew it. Culin did not invent the idea of cutting through a hedge rather than climbing over it. That idea belonged, by his own account, to a private from Tennessee named Roberts, a farm boy who had said it half as a joke during an idle conversation that everyone else in earshot had laughed off within seconds. Culin's contribution was recognizing that the joke was not actually a joke, then finding the steel, doing the welding, and proving under fire that the idea worked. Those were not small contributions. But according to the account later recorded by historian Max Hastings, Culin himself tried, more than once, to make sure Roberts received credit for the original idea. It did not matter. The Army and the press that reported on the Army's achievements wanted a single name attached to a single invention, and Culin's name was the one already on the paperwork, the one demonstrated in front of General Bradley, the one that would appear in official histories written years later. Roberts, the man whose offhand remark had started the entire chain of events, faded into the background of a story that could not accommodate 2 names when it only needed one to be memorable. His full identity was never widely recorded. He remains, in the histories that survive, simply Roberts, a private from Tennessee, a footnote to an invention that carried someone else's name into the history books. There is something honest in that unfairness, something that reflects how war actually works, far more accurately than any story of a single genius ever could. Ideas rarely belong to one person. They pass from a tired joke told in a muddy field, to a sergeant who takes it seriously, to a general who recognizes its value, to an army desperate enough to act on it within days instead of months. Everyone in that chain contributed something necessary. Only one of them got his name remembered. Culin's own war did not end with the triumph of Operation Cobra. 4 months later, in November 1944, while fighting in the dense, freezing forests of the Hurtgen region near the German border, in a campaign that would prove even bloodier and more grinding than the hedgerows of Normandy had been, Culin stepped on a landmine. He survived, but he lost a leg in the explosion. The same kind of catastrophic anonymous violence that had killed so many of the men he had once tried to save from the hedges of Normandy. The war that had made him briefly famous for a piece of scrap steel took a piece of him in return. In a forest most Americans back home had never heard of, fighting an enemy that had retreated from France only to dig in again along its own border with the same desperate determination. For his invention, Culin received the Legion of Merit, one of the United States military's higher decorations, awarded for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service. It was a fitting recognition of what he had done, even if it could not fully capture the collaborative, accidental, deeply human way the hedgerow cutter had actually come into being. Born from a joke, built from enemy wreckage, and proven not in a laboratory but in a field where men were still dying while the testing happened. He returned home after the war to Cranford, New Jersey, the same town where he had grown up an only child in a family whose name went back 3 generations, walking now on an artificial leg through streets he had known since childhood, among neighbors who may or may not have understood that the quiet man who had come home was, for a few weeks in the summer of 1944, the reason thousands of other men's sons had made it home at all. He lived until 1963, dying at the age of 48, having spent his final 2 decades as one more veteran among millions who had gone to war, done what needed doing, and come home to a country that mostly moved on, without asking too many questions about what that had cost, or which of its returning soldiers had quietly changed the course of a campaign with nothing more than scrap steel and the refusal to laugh at an idea everyone else had already dismissed. The device that carried his name outlived him by decades. Post-war military analysis studied the hedgerow cutters built in the field during the summer of 1944 and incorporated the lessons into official doctrine, changing how the Army thought about combat engineering, about the value of field expedient solutions, and about the willingness to adopt an idea quickly when soldiers on the ground had already proven it worked, regardless of whether it had come through any official channel. The Culin device itself became a footnote in armor doctrine, studied by cadets and historians as an example of battlefield ingenuity, solving a problem that had stumped an army's planners for weeks. What is easy to lose, in a story with a name and a medal and a place in the history books, is the truth of how it actually happened. Not one man's genius, but a chain of ordinary people responding to an extraordinary problem with whatever they had. A farm boy from Tennessee who said something true without expecting anyone to listen. A sergeant from New Jersey who did not laugh when everyone else did, and who understood, from a lifetime of fixing broken things because nothing else was available, that a joke and an answer sometimes sound exactly the same the moment before someone tests them. A general willing to bypass every normal channel of military bureaucracy because 6 weeks of stalled war had taught him that the ordinary channels were too slow for the war he was actually fighting. And an army of welders, ordnance crews, and tank commanders who spent 10 desperate days turning one sergeant's scrap metal experiment into standard equipment for an entire field army. None of them set out to be remembered. They were trying to survive a war that had trapped them in a landscape of hedges nobody had trained them for, using the only tools any of them had ever really been given: scrap metal, stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that the only way through a wall was over the top of it. That refusal cost nothing to try and everything to ignore, and in the summer of 1944, in a muddy corner of Normandy that no map ever bothered to name, it turned out to be worth more than anyone standing in that field could have guessed. Somewhere in that refusal is the real story of the hedgerow cutter, truer than any single name could carry alone. It was laughed at once, in a muddy field in June, by men who had every reason to expect it would fail like everything else they had tried. 6 weeks later, It helped tear open the road to Paris.